The millionaire faked a business trip, but discovered what the nanny was doing with his children. There was no squeak from the lock. Mr. Richard had personally oiled the bolts the night before, setting the stage for his perfect trap. The house was shrouded in that deceptive quiet that precedes storms, or so he believed. His hand, firm and encased in a black leather glove, turned the front doorknob with exasperating slowness. He carried his briefcase in the other hand, not because he had work, but because it was part of the disguise. He was supposed to be 30,000 feet in the air, flying to a conference in New York. The house was supposed to be empty of his presence, leaving a clear path for the new nanny to show her true colors. Richard hated uncertainty. Since his wife's death, his life had become a grid of schedules, rules, and obligatory silences. He had fired 4 nannies in 6 months, one for being 5 minutes late, another for using her phone while feeding the twins, another simply because her laughter seemed too shrill for a house in mourning. But this Emily was an enigma, too young, too inexperienced, and according to Mrs. Henderson, his trusted housekeeper, too common for the family's standards. "I tell you, when you're not here, that girl does strange things, Mrs." Henderson had whispered that morning with that grimace of false concern that Richard interpreted as loyalty. "The children don't cry, sir, and that's not normal. Children always cry. If they don't cry, it's because she has them drugged or scared." Those words burned in his chest as he pushed the door open. A widowed father's fear is dangerous fuel. It turns into anger before there's proof. Richard stepped in, placed his briefcase on the floor delicately, and sharpened his ears. He expected crying. He expected to see Emily sleeping on the sofa. He expected to see the television on full blast, but what he heard froze him in the foyer. It wasn't crying, it wasn't television. It was a guttural, explosive, rhythmic sound laughter, but not timid giggles. Instead, it was deep, belly laughter, the kind that hurts your stomach, and which he hadn't heard in that house for over a year. It was his children, Liam and Ethan. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, wondering what they were laughing at. Curiosity and panic mingled. He advanced down the hallway, his Italian-soled shoes barely grazing the polished wood, guided by the sound of someone else's joy, which he felt as a personal affront in his solemn home. Upon reaching the living room threshold, the scene that unfolded before his eyes was so absurd, so surreal, and so contrary to any rule of etiquette that his brain took several seconds to process the information. The room, usually a temple of minimalist order and neutral colors, looked like the set of an avant-garde play. And in the center of it all was her, Emily. She wasn't sitting reading a story. She wasn't preparing bottles. The dark-haired young woman was lying on the floor, face up, completely stretched out on the beige rug. But what made Richard's mouth drop open in disbelief was her attire and posture. She wore that bright blue caregiver uniform that Mrs. Henderson had forced her to wear, saying it gave the house class, but on her hands, she wore bright yellow rubber gloves, the kind used to scrub toilets or clean greasy dishes. "Up, my brave ones!" Emily shouted from the floor with a smile so wide it seemed to distort her face with pure happiness. Richard blinked in astonishment. His children, his heirs, the twins Liam and Ethan, barely a year old, were standing on her, literally on top of her. It was a human tower of instability and jubilation. Liam was standing on the nanny's chest with his colorful sneakers, stepping on the embroidered logo of the uniform, while Ethan balanced on her stomach. The children wore their light denim overalls and white t-shirts, and looked like little acrobats drunk on adrenaline. "Watch out for the north wind," Emily exclaimed and moved her body, simulating a gentle earthquake. Ethan, the smaller and more fragile one, the one doctors had said had motor problems, the one who barely crawled when Richard was present, was standing there, upright, his legs trembling from the effort, but laughing with his mouth open, showing his few white gums. The baby stabilized himself by placing his plump little hands on Emily's shoulders, using her as a balance bar, while his brother Liam raised his arms in the air, as if he had just conquered Mount Everest. Natural light poured through the large windows, illuminating the suspended dust that the movement had raised. It was a picture of perfect chaos. Emily held the children's ankles with her bright yellow gloved hands, her legs stretched and tense, acting as the solid base of that human house of cards. To any outsider, it would have been a photograph of pure love, of instinctive connection. But for Richard, filtered by the pain of his widowhood and the obsession with control, it was an aberration. He saw germs on the gloves, he saw danger in the height, he saw disrespect on the floor, he saw a household employee turning his children into circus attractions. Blood rushed to his head. The businessman, the cold strategist, disappeared. Only the terrified father and the offended employer remained. What in hell? he whispered first, unable to raise his voice. At that moment, Emily made an airplane sound with her mouth, and the children burst into a new wave of laughter, oblivious to the dark, rigid figure observing them from the doorway, suitcase forgotten and eyes injected with fury. Richard felt that this happiness was an insult to his pain. How dare she make them laugh like that when he, their own father, couldn't even coax a smile from them? The spell broke with the sound of Richard's voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a dry, authoritative thunderclap, loaded with venom. Emily. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The physical harmony that kept the three in balance depended entirely on concentration and calm. Hearing the roar of her name, Emily had an involuntary spasm of fright. Her body tensed against the floor. The twins, sensitive as radars to environmental tension, stopped laughing instantly. Their faces went from euphoria to terror in a fraction of a second. Ethan, who was on the nanny's stomach, lost his footing as he abruptly turned his head towards the door. His little legs failed. The baby tilted dangerously to the right, towards the hard wooden floor. "Careful," Richard shouted, stepping forward, but he was too far to reach in time. But Emily didn't need to reach. She was already there. Her reflexes were not those of a distracted employee. They were those of a lioness. Before Richard could finish his exclamation, Emily had already released their ankles, and her hands, those ridiculous yellow-gloved hands, shot out like springs. With her right hand, she caught Ethan in midair, cradling his head against her chest before he touched the ground, and with her left arm, she wrapped around Liam's waist, pulling him towards her in a protective embrace. In one fluid movement, she rolled onto her back and sat up on the floor with both children pressed against her chest, gasping. The twins, now safe but infected by the sudden fear that had flooded the room, burst into tears in unison, a sharp cry of panic that pierced Richard's ears. Richard strode across the room, his face distorted. "Let go of my children," he ordered, reaching them and roughly pulling Liam from the nanny's arms. "Let them go right now." Emily remained on the floor with empty, trembling hands. Looking up, she brushed a lock of hair from her face with the back of her yellow glove, her large, dark eyes filled with a mixture of fright and confusion. "Mr. Richard, you were supposed to," she stammered, trying to catch her breath. "I was supposed to be on a trip," he cut her off, his voice echoing against the high walls. "And thank God I came back. What kind of madness is this?" Richard held Liam, who squirmed in his arms, stretching his little hands towards Emily and shouting, "Nana! Nana!" His son's rejection was like a physical slap to Richard. He clumsily placed the child on the sofa and turned to Emily, who was beginning to stand with difficulty. "Don't get up," he snapped, pointing an accusing finger at her. "Stay where you belong, on the floor. Do you have any idea what could have happened? One more inch, and my son would have split his head open on the coffee table." "Sir, I had it under control," Emily tried to explain, her voice cracking, but maintaining a strange dignity. "I never let them fall. We were doing exercises." "Exercises?" Richard let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You call that exercise? I saw you. You were sprawled like an animal, with those filthy toilet-cleaning gloves, letting my children stomp all over you as if you were old furniture. The gloves are new, sir. I only use them for playing because of the color. They like the color yellow. It helps them focus their sight," she said quickly, trying to appeal to reason. "I'm not interested in your cheap daycare excuses." Richard ran a hand through his hair, disheveled for the first time in years. The image of the children laughing with her and crying with him was eating him alive. "I pay you a salary you wouldn't earn in 10 years anywhere else. I pay you to care for them, to educate them, to teach them manners and safety, not to set up a circus show in my living room." Richard looked around as if seeking witnesses to the atrocity. "Look at you. It's pathetic. A woman your age rolling around. What would people think if they walked in right now? What would my wife think if she saw the woman in charge of her children treating them like toys?" The mention of his deceased wife was a low blow. Emily lowered her gaze, biting her lower lip, to keep from crying in front of him. She knew she shouldn't respond. She needed the job. Her sick mother depended on that salary. But Ethan's crying, as he continued to crawl towards her on the floor and cling to her uniformed leg, gave her a strength she didn't know she had. "Sir," Emily said, and her tone changed. It was no longer apologetic. It was a maternal plea. Ethan was laughing. Liam was laughing. They hadn't laughed like that in months. That's not laughter. "Hysteria is not happiness, Emily," Richard roared, blind to the truth. "Disorder is not joy. You have confused freedom with license. You have endangered my children's physical integrity for a stupid game." You are irresponsible." Richard bent down to pull Ethan away from Emily's leg. The baby clung tightly to the blue fabric of the uniform, crying desperately, burying his little face in the nanny's knee. Richard had to use force to peel his own son's fingers off the employee's clothing. "Come here!" Richard growled, picking up Ethan. The child kicked, hitting his father's chest with his tiny fists, rejecting the contact of the expensive suit and seeking the arms of the woman with the rubber gloves. That was the last straw. Richard felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it blurred his vision. "Get out of my sight!" Richard hissed, with the child crying in his arms. "Go to your room, pack your things, and wait for me to decide what I'm going to do with you. And take off those ridiculous gloves. In this house, we are serious people, not clowns." Emily slowly stood up, calmly removed the yellow gloves, revealing her red, working hands. She looked at the children one last time. Liam watched her from the sofa, with huge wet eyes. Ethan was still crying in his father's arms. "I just wanted them to lose their fear of falling, sir," she whispered so softly that Richard barely heard her. "The only thing they've lost today is respect," he replied, turning his back on her. "Get out." Emily walked towards the service door, feeling each step as a defeat. Behind her, the twins' crying grew louder, filling the house with a noise that was no longer joy, but a heartbreaking lament. Richard stood alone in the middle of his perfect living room with two children who didn't want him, and a victory that tasted like ashes. At the end of the hallway, Mrs. Henderson's shadow watched the scene, and a crooked, cruel smile formed on her aged face. The plan had worked perfectly, or so it seemed. The silence that Mr. Richard so revered had been murdered, and in its place, a chaos of sharp, uncoordinated cries governed the mansion. Liam and Ethan weren't crying like capricious children wanting a sweet. They cried with the deep anguish of abandonment. Richard sat on the edge of the beige leather sofa, his body rigid and his arms clumsy, trying to hold Ethan, who arched backwards with surprising strength for his size, screaming towards the hallway where Emily had disappeared. At the other end of the sofa, Liam hit the cushions with his clenched fists, his face red and bathed in tears and snot, rejecting any attempt at paternal comfort. "Enough," Richard shouted, but his voice, accustomed to giving orders in soundproof boardrooms, cracked before the hysteria of his own children. "Liam, Ethan, silent. Daddy's here." But Daddy was a stranger in a dark suit with the scent of expensive cologne, an intruder in their world of games and warmth. Richard felt a pang of futility in his chest. He had millions in the bank. He controlled international companies, but he couldn't make two one-year-old babies stop crying. He felt small. He felt like a failure. And that feeling of failure quickly transformed into resentment towards the cause of it all, Emily. It was in that moment of extreme vulnerability that the shadow appeared. Mrs. Henderson didn't walk. She glided. She entered the room with the precision of a predator sniffing blood, carrying a glass of ice water on a perfectly polished silver tray. Her dark gray uniform was impeccable, without a single wrinkle, in absolute contrast to the vital disorder that Emily represented. Her face, marked by lines of disguised bitterness beneath a mask of efficient servitude, showed a perverse satisfaction that Richard, in his desperation, couldn't read. "Mr. Richard," she said in a soft, oily voice, placing the tray on the coffee table with a delicate clink. "Have some water. You look pale." "I told you this return trip would be hectic." Richard took the glass. His hands trembled slightly. The ice clinked against the crystal. "They won't stop, Mrs. Henderson. They won't stop," he murmured, running a hand over his sweaty forehead. "They've been like this for 10 minutes. What did that woman do to them?" Mrs. Henderson sighed a long, theatrical sound as she bent down with false tenderness towards Liam, though without actually touching him, as if the child were a contagious museum piece. "What did she do to them, sir?" "The question is, what didn't she do?" the housekeeper whispered, injecting the poison drop by drop. "She spoiled them, turned them into savages. You saw how she was sprawled on the floor, with her legs open and those rubber gloves she looked." She paused dramatically, searching for the word that would most wound Richard's conservative pride. She looked like a common street person, not an educator. Richard squeezed the glass. The image of Emily on the floor laughing came back to him, now filtered by Mrs. Henderson's words. The scene seemed grotesque, dirty. She said it was a game. Richard defended himself weakly, not because he wanted to defend Emily, but because he needed to believe it hadn't been that bad. A game? Mrs. Henderson let out a dry chuckle, looking him directly in the eyes with compassionate seriousness. "Sir, I have served in the best houses in the city for 40 years. I've seen professional nannies. They read, they teach languages, they keep children clean and presentable. This girl, this Emily, she comes from the common mire, sir. And the common mire is all she has to offer. Liam threw a wooden toy that hit Mrs. Henderson's shin. The woman barely blinked, but her eyes flashed with icy coldness towards the baby before returning to Richard with sweetness. Look at them. They're aggressive, out of control. That's what she teaches them, disobedience. She enjoys seeing you lose control, sir. It's her way of feeling powerful. These poor girls always envy good people. She wants to be the mother. She wants to take the place of Mrs. Laura. May she rest in peace. The mention of his dead wife was the final trigger. Richard jumped to his feet, leaving Ethan on the sofa. The pain of his wife's absence was a wound that had never closed, and the idea that some commoner would try to usurp that sacred place blinded him with rage. She will never be like my wife, Richard growled, his jaw tense. Of course not, sir. Mrs. Laura was an angel, a lady. This girl smells of bleach and cheap sweat, Mrs. Henderson insisted, taking another step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. But children are innocent. They get confused. If you allow her to stay here one more day, they will forget who their father is. They will forget the family name they bear. They will become what you saw today, a circus. Richard looked at his children. They were red, sweaty, their shirts untucked, crying inconsolably. They didn't look like the heirs to an empire. They looked like broken children. And in his logic, twisted by grief and manipulation, Richard decided that the fault was not his absence or his coldness, but the nanny's excessive warmth. You're right, Mrs. Henderson, Richard said, regaining his upright posture, hardening his heart. This ends today. I will not allow my house to become a common mess. Mrs. Henderson nodded, hiding a triumphant smile as she smoothed her apron. It's for the best, sir, for the children's sake. We must cut out the infection before it spreads. Do you want me to call security to have her removed? No, Richard said, adjusting his tie with a sharp movement. I'll do it myself. I want to see her face when she understands that my family is not to be trifled with. As Richard left the room with a martial stride towards the service area, Mrs. Henderson remained alone with the twins. She looked at them with disdain, took a handkerchief from her pocket, and wiped the spot where Liam's toy had hit her. Cry all you want, brats, she whispered to the still screaming babies. The party's over. The service quarters were at the end of a narrow hallway behind the kitchen, an architectural border separating luxury from labor. Emily stood there beside her small single bed. She hadn't unpacked much because, deep down, she had always feared this moment would come. Her suitcase, an old canvas bag with a worn zipper, lay open on the mattress. Her hands, now without the yellow gloves, trembled as she folded her street clothes. She wasn't crying over the dismissal. She had been fired before by demanding employers. She cried because she could hear Liam and Ethan's cries piercing through the house walls, calling her name. Each nanna was a stab to her chest. She knew Ethan needed his leg massage before his nap, or his muscles would ache. She knew Liam needed her to sing the Grey Elephant song, or he wouldn't sleep. And she knew that Mr. Richard, with all his wealth, knew none of that. The door opened without knocking. It wasn't a push, it was an invasion. Richard entered, filling the small space with his overwhelming presence and contained anger. The room suddenly felt minuscule. Are you finished? He asked. His voice was dry ice. There were no shouts now, only a quiet, devastating contempt. Emily turned, hugging a t-shirt against her chest as if it were a shield. I'm packing my things, sir. I just need a few minutes. Richard took a step inside, scanning the room with a grimace of disgust, as if the air there was of lower quality. He saw a drawing taped to the wall, a crayon scribble Liam had made the day before. Emily had kept it as if it were a masterpiece. Richard tore it from the wall with a rough movement. The sound of ripping paper was violent in the tense silence. Don't take anything that isn't yours, Richard said, crumpling the drawing and letting it fall to the floor like trash. In this house, everything is family property, even my children's memories. Emily felt blood rush to her cheeks. The humiliation wasn't about the money. It was about the denial of her humanity. Nico gave me that drawing, sir. It's just paper, she said, her voice trembling but holding his gaze. To you, it's a trophy, proof that you managed to manipulate them, Richard responded, taking a leather wallet from his inner pocket. He opened the wallet and pulled out a thick wad of bills without even counting them. Here you go. It's your full month's salary, plus severance. It's much more than you deserve for the grotesque show you put on in my living room today. He threw the bills onto the bed beside the open suitcase. The money fell haphazardly, some bills sliding to the floor. It was a calculated gesture to make her feel small, a commercial transaction to buy her silence and her disappearance. Take it and leave. I never want to see you near this property again. If I hear you try to contact the children, I'll call the police. I have lawyers who could ruin your life before you could blink. Emily looked at the scattered money. She could have paid for her mother's medicine for 3 months with that, but at that moment, the money felt dirty. She took a deep breath, swallowing her pride, and looked up at Richard. Her dark eyes, usually sweet, now shone with a dignity Richard hadn't expected to find in someone in a cheap uniform. Mr. Richard, she said, ignoring the bills. You can insult me all you want. You can say I'm common, that I'm poor, that I have no class, but don't lie to yourself. What you saw today wasn't a circus. It was love. Richard tensed, ready to interrupt her, but something in her voice stopped him. These children are hungry, sir, and not for expensive food or imported toys. They are hungry for someone to get down on the floor with them. They are hungry for someone to touch them without fear of dirtying their suit. You think you're firing me for being messy, but deep down, you're firing me because it hurts you to see that a stranger gives them what you cannot give them because you're too busy being sad. Silence, Richard roared, hitting the doorframe with his open hand. The truth had struck the core of his wound. You know nothing of my pain. You are a mere employee. I am the person who taught your son to stand, Emily replied, softly but relentlessly. Ethan wasn't walking because he was scared. Today he stood on me because he trusted I wouldn't let him fall. Can you say the same? If they fall, will you be there to catch them? Or will you be worried about wrinkling your shirt? The silence that followed was dense, heavy. Richard breathed heavily, his eyes bloodshot. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to kick her out, but her words had stuck like splinters in his conscience. The image of Ethan standing, balancing, drilled into his mind. Get out, Richard whispered, pointing towards the exit. Get out of my house. Now. Emily closed her suitcase. She didn't pick up the money from the floor. She only took the wad that had fallen onto the bed, just enough for the day's work, and left the rest, the humiliating tip, scattered on the bedspread. She slung the bag over her shoulder and walked towards the door. Richard had to step aside to let her pass. She didn't lower her head. As she passed him, she paused for a second. She didn't look him in the eye. She looked towards the hallway leading to the children's rooms. Ethan only falls asleep if you rub his back in circles to the right, she said, her voice broken. And Liam is afraid of complete darkness. Please leave the hallway light on. And, with that last instruction, a lesson in love disguised as technical advice, Emily left the service quarters and crossed the kitchen towards the back exit. Richard remained alone in the tiny room, surrounded by bills no one wanted, and with the echo of a truth he didn't want to accept. From the living room, the twins' crying had changed. It was no longer hysteria. Now it was a tired, hoarse cry of resignation, the sound of a house that once again became cold, orderly, and terribly empty. Richard looked at the crumpled drawing on the floor, the splash of color in his gray world, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a terrible fear of being alone with his own children. The hallway connecting the kitchen to the service exit had never seemed so long. Emily walked with her head held high, though inside her legs felt like lead. Each step took her further from the children, and the silence she left behind was deceptive. As soon as her hand touched the back door handle, a heartbreaking scream shattered the atmosphere. It wasn't a tantrum. It was the sound of absolute panic. "Ethan!" The crying turned into a convulsive cough. Emily froze. Her instinct screamed at her to run back, but her dignity and the dismissal order nailed her to the floor. "Wait!" Richard's voice boomed from the kitchen archway. It wasn't a request. It was an exclamation of urgency disguised as authority. Emily slowly turned. Richard was there, disheveled, his tie loosened, his face pale. In his arms, Ethan arched violently, his face purple from the effort of crying, rejecting contact with his father, as if his designer suit were made of thorns. "He won't calm down," Richard said, breathing heavily. The arrogance of 5 minutes ago had cracked. The powerful man who moved millions with a phone call couldn't stop a 2-6-pound baby from crying. "I tried what you said, the back thing, but it's not working. He's choking." Emily dropped her suitcase. The sound of the canvas hitting the floor was the only response. She walked towards him not as an employee, but as an expert entering a disaster zone. "Give him to me," she ordered. Her voice was soft, but it had an underlying steel that brooked no argument. Richard, overcome by desperation, handed her the child. The instant Ethan smelled the neutral soap and felt the texture of Emily's uniform, the change was miraculous. The baby buried his face in her neck. His tiny hands gripped the blue fabric with desperate strength, and the screams ceased, replaced by broken sobs and deep sighs of relief. Richard watched the scene stunned. He felt a pang of jealousy, but also a corrosive doubt that began to eat at his pride. "What do you do to them?" Richard asked. This time without anger, only with genuine confusion. "The best pediatricians in the country told me Ethan is a distant child, that his motor condition frustrates him, that's why he's aggressive. But with you, he's a different child." Emily rocked Ethan rhythmically, ignoring her employer's presence, focused on lowering the little one's heart rate. "His doctors read files, Mr. Richard." "I read your children," she replied without looking at him. "Ethan isn't distant. Ethan is scared. Scared that his legs won't respond. Scared of falling and that no one will celebrate him. You saw a circus in the living room. Ethan saw a challenge he could overcome." Richard ran a hand over his face in frustration. "You mentioned earlier that he stood up. That's impossible. Doctor." Thompson was clear. "Severe muscular hypotonia in the lower limbs. He said he might walk at 2 years old with braces. Don't lie to me to get your job back." Emily looked up. Her eyes shone with an intensity that made Richard take a step back. "I don't lie, sir, and I don't want a job where I'm treated like trash. But I won't let you keep believing your son is an invalid just because you lack the faith to see him try." "Faith?" Richard let out an incredulous laugh. "Faith doesn't cure medical conditions, Emily. Science does. And science says my son can't stand on his own." "Then science is wrong," Emily declared. "Or maybe science needs love to work. Do you think I was just playing on the floor? What you saw, that human tower, that isometric exercise, by standing on my stomach, Ethan has to adjust his balance every second because I breathe, because I move. His brain is forced to connect with his muscles in a way that no cold therapy machine can achieve." Richard fell silent, processing the information. It made sense. It was logical. But it was too simple, too humble to be true. "Prove it," Richard challenged, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "If what you say is true, demonstrate it now." "Here." Emily looked at Ethan, who was now calm, eyes closed, resting on her shoulder. Then she looked at Richard. She knew it was a risk. The child was tired, stressed. If she failed, Richard would have the perfect excuse to fire her and humiliate her for life. But if she didn't, Ethan would return to a life of "you can't," condemned by a paper diagnosis. "Let's go to the living room," Emily said, walking past Richard and back into the house. "And please, sir, if this works, don't clap, don't shout, just watch." The living room was as they had left it, with toys scattered and the echo of the previous argument still lingering in the air. Liam, who had been left alone on the sofa crying softly, raised his head when he saw Emily enter. He stretched out his arms, but Emily gave him a gentle wait gesture with her hand, a signal the child understood instantly. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the side hallway, attracted by the unexpected return. Seeing Emily back in the living room, her face contorted into a grimace of indignation. "Sir, what is this woman still doing here?" the housekeeper snapped, advancing quickly. "I thought we had already cleared the house of silence, Mrs. Henderson." Richard barked without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Emily and his son. The tone was so cutting that the old woman stopped dead in her tracks, mouth open, offended and surprised. Richard stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a defensive posture that concealed his terror. He wanted to believe, but he was terrified of being disappointed again. Emily walked to the center of the beige rug. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to Ethan's eye level. With infinite delicacy, she peeled the child from her chest and placed him standing on the rug. Her large, warm hands held the little one's waist. Ethan wobbled. His little legs, encased in denim overalls, trembled visibly. He instinctively tried to grasp Emily's clothing, whimpering slightly. "You're holding him," Richard accused from the doorway, his voice laden with skepticism. "If you let go, he'll fall. That always happens." "Shh," Emily hushed, without taking her eyes off the child. "Ethan, look at me, my love. You are strong, you are a giant." Emily withdrew her hands from the child's waist, but left them millimeters from his body, ready to catch him, creating an invisible force field of security. Ethan stood there, swaying like a leaf in the wind, his knees bent inward. "He's going to fall," Mrs. Henderson whispered with venom. "It's cruelty. I said be quiet," Richard roared, his heart pounding in his throat. Ethan looked around, scared by the empty space. His eyes sought his father, but Richard was a distant, blurry statue. Then they returned to Emily. She was there, smiling with that radiant smile that promised everything would be all right. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with pride. Emily slowly backed away, 1 step, 2 steps, crawling on her knees, moving away from the child. "Come, Ethan," she whispered, extending her open arms. "Come to Nana, come for a hug." The distance was barely a meter, but for a child with hypotonia, it was an abyss. Ethan let out a whimper of frustration, looked at his feet, looked at Emily, and then it happened. Ethan clenched his tiny fists at his sides. His face wrinkled in a gesture of absolute concentration. He took a deep breath, inflating his small chest, and lifted his right foot. It wasn't an elegant movement. It was clumsy, heavy, a thump against the wooden floor that resonated in the sepulchral silence of the room. Richard stopped breathing. His nails dug into his own arms through the suit fabric. His left foot followed. 1 step. Ethan leaned dangerously forward. Richard made a move to run and catch him, but Emily looked up and gave him a searing glance that stopped him cold. "Trust," her eyes said. The child regained his balance, waving his arms. He took another step, and another. My God. The whisper escaped Richard's lips like an involuntary prayer. These weren't the shuffled steps of a sick child. They were the determined steps of a child with a goal. Ethan let out a nervous giggle, a mix of fear and excitement, and lunged forward in the last 2 steps, falling into Emily's open arms. "That's it!" Emily cried, hugging him and rolling with him on the rug, showering his face with kisses. "You did it! You're a champion!" Liam, from the sofa, began to clap and laugh, infected by his brother's victory. The scene was irrefutable proof. No doctor, no equipment, no thousands of dollars in therapy had achieved what this woman had achieved with patience, a floor, and love. Richard felt the ground open beneath his feet. His entire belief system, based on paying for the best and demanding immediate results, crumbled. He looked at his son, laughing in the vulgar maid's arms, and then looked at his own empty hands. He realized with a sharp pain in his chest that he didn't know his son. He didn't know he could walk. He didn't know he could be brave. He had missed the miracle by being too busy judging the method. Mrs. Henderson, seeing the narrative slipping from her hands, decided to play her last, dirtiest card. "Well," the old woman said with disdain, breaking the magical moment. "Walking is one thing, but decency is another. Sir, don't let this carnival trick cloud your judgment. Remember what I told you. Remember what's missing from Mrs. Laura's safe." Richard, who still had tears of astonishment in his eyes, turned to Mrs. Henderson. The mention of the safe was like a bucket of ice water. The emotion of the miracle clashed violently with the suspicion that had been planted. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to say it in front of her, sir," Mrs. Henderson lied, pointing a bony finger at Emily. "But while you were away, I noticed your late wife's diamond brooch was missing, the one you guard so carefully, and coincidentally, this woman is the only one who comes to clean your study." Emily slowly stood up, with Ethan still in her arms. Her face paled. "I have never touched anything in that safe," she said, her voice firm, but trembling from the accusation. "Never." Richard looked at Emily, then at his son in her arms, and finally at Mrs. Henderson. Doubt settled in his mind again, toxic and quick. The physical miracle was undeniable, but the moral? Was it possible that this woman was an angel with the children and a devil with his assets? "Mrs. Henderson," Richard said, his face hardening again. "Are you sure of what you're saying?" "As sure as I'm standing here, sir." "Check her backpack, check that old bag she carries. If she has nothing to fear, she won't mind us looking, will she?" The trap was set, and Richard, a man of facts and evidence, walked towards the canvas bag Emily had left at the living room entrance. The tension in the room shifted from euphoria to police terror in a second. Richard's hand closed over the strap of the old canvas bag. The air in the room became unbreathable, charged with static electricity that raised goosebumps. Ethan, still in Emily's arms, stopped laughing when he felt the tension in his nanny's body. Liam, from the sofa, put a finger to his mouth, watching with wide, scared eyes as his father invaded the only private property of the woman who gave them affection. Emily didn't move to stop him. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. She simply pressed Ethan a little tighter against her chest, holding her chin up with a dignity that contrasted painfully with her wrinkled uniform and worn shoes. "If that's what you need to believe in my honesty, do it," Emily said. Her voice didn't tremble, though her knees did. "But you do it. Don't let her touch my things." Richard looked at Mrs. Henderson, who waited with a predatory smile, anticipating the sparkle of diamonds among the humble clothes. Then, with a sharp movement, Richard emptied the contents of the bag onto the glass coffee table, right next to the vase that was worth more than his employee's entire life. Objects fell, but there was no heavy sound of jewelry. A hairbrush with worn bristles fell out. 2 pairs of white socks, mended at the heel, fell out. A box of hypertension pills with the generic pharmacy price still attached fell out. And a small, homemade laminated photograph fell out. Nothing else, no brooch, no money, nothing of material value. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard rummaged through the objects with his hand, expecting to find a false bottom, a secret pocket, something to justify the accusation and his own paranoia. But he only touched the dignified poverty of a working woman. He picked up the photograph. It was a blurry image of an older woman in a wheelchair, smiling with the same warmth as Emily. On the back, trembling handwriting read, "So you don't forget who you're fighting for, daughter." Richard felt a sudden nausea. Shame crept up his neck like a burn. He had violated the privacy of someone who only kept medicine for her mother and memories. "It's not here," Richard murmured, dropping the photo as if it burned. Mrs. Henderson, whose face had gone from smugness to disbelief, stepped forward, losing her composure. "Impossible! It has to be there!" the old woman shrieked, lunging at the table and rummaging through the old socks with her bony hands. "Are you sure it's in her uniform pockets? Check her. That thief is cunning." "Sir, enough!" Richard's shout made the window panes vibrate. He grabbed Mrs. Henderson's wrist before she could touch Emily. He looked at her with cold fury, a mixture of disappointment and exhaustion. "There has been enough humiliation for today," Richard said, releasing the housekeeper's hand with disdain. "There's nothing. You were wrong, or worse, you lied." "Sir, I would never, Mrs." Henderson began to defend herself, backing away, pale. "Go to the kitchen now," he ordered, without looking at her. When the old woman disappeared, grumbling and dragging her venom towards the hallway, Richard remained alone with Emily and the children. The atmosphere changed, but it did not relax. Richard's shame quickly transformed into a defensive barrier. He couldn't apologize. His pride as a powerful man didn't know how to bend so much without breaking. He had to maintain control. He had to be the boss. He picked up the medicine box and the photo and put them back into the bag with stiff movements. Then he looked at Emily. She didn't look at him with hatred, but with a deep sadness that he found unbearable. "You've proven my son can walk," Richard said, his voice regaining that formal, distant boardroom tone. "And you've proven you didn't steal anything today." "I've proven I'm a decent person, sir." "That should be enough," she replied. "In my world, decency is the minimum, not a merit," he retorted, shielding himself with his coldness. "Listen carefully, Emily. I'm not going to fire you. I can't. Not after seeing Ethan. Clearly, you have an influence over them that I don't understand, but it works." Emily's eyes brightened slightly, a spark of hope, not for the money, but for not having to abandon the little ones. But Richard interrupted, raising an authoritative index finger. "Things are going to change. You stay. But you're on probation, real probation. No games on the floor, no shouting, no wild behavior. I want you to behave like a top-level professional." Richard walked around her, marking his territory. "You will always wear a clean, ironed uniform. The children will eat at the table, not on the sofa. If they play, it will be with educational toys. Not building human towers. I want order, Emily. I want silence after 8 p.m. I want this house to be a respectable home again, not a playground. You have 1 week. If in 1 week I see a single yellow rubber glove lying in my living room, you're gone without a dime. Understood?" It was a cruel deal. He asked her to stay, but forbade her from using the very tools. The play, the laughter, the uninhibited physical contact that had achieved the miracle. He asked her to heal his children, but without loving them too much. Emily looked at Ethan, who was playing with the buttons on her uniform. She knew that accepting these conditions was like trying to put out a fire with an eyedropper, but she looked at the child's legs, those legs that had just taken their first steps. If she left, those legs would atrophy again in a chair. "Understood, sir," she said softly. "I'll do it your way." "Good." Richard adjusted his tie, feeling falsely victorious. "Settle back in. Tomorrow, I'll start working from my home office. I'll be watching every move. Don't disappoint me." Richard left the living room without looking back, taking his loneliness with him and leaving Emily with a bitter victory. She had the job, but her soul had been forbidden. The next 3 days were a torture of gray velvet. The house, once punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter, had fallen under a suffocating mantle of correctness. "Mr." Richard kept his word. He cancelled the rest of his Geneva agenda and locked himself in his study, a dark wood-paneled room on the first floor, with the door slightly ajar just enough to hear what was happening downstairs. He sat in front of his computer, pretending to review balance sheets and contracts, but his senses were completely focused on the hallway and the living room. He was a spy in his own castle. He wanted to prove to himself that he was right, that order brought peace, that structure brought well-being, but what he heard was slowly killing him. He heard Emily's footsteps, rhythmic and soft. He heard her voice, now subdued, saying things like, "Sit up straight, Liam. Don't throw your food, my love. Mr. Richard will get upset." He heard the silence. A heavy, dense silence, only broken by an occasional brief cry from the twins. A cry of boredom and frustration that Emily quickly calmed with a, "Shh. It'll pass. It'll pass." There was no laughter, no running, no life. On the third day, curiosity overcame pride. Richard got up from his ergonomic leather chair and tiptoed to the door. He peered into the hallway that led to the interior balcony, from which the living room downstairs could be seen without being seen. The scene he saw broke his heart. The children were sitting on the rug, surrounded by expensive imported wooden toys and neutral-colored building blocks. They were clean, impeccable, their hair neatly parted. Emily sat in a chair, watching them with her hands folded in her lap, exactly as he had ordered, like a professional. It looked like a magazine decorating photo, perfect, cold, dead. Liam held a red block, looked at it with disinterest, and dropped it. Ethan lay face down, sucking his thumb, his gaze lost on the ceiling. He wasn't trying to get up. He wasn't trying to walk. Why? There was no one on the floor waiting for him with open arms. Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest. Was this what he wanted? Children who looked like mannequins? Was this the decency Mrs. Henderson so staunchly defended? Suddenly, Emily looked at the wall clock. It was 11 a.m. She knew Richard usually had video conferences at that time and wore headphones. Believing the ogre was disconnected from the world, Emily transformed. It was subtle at first. She slid from the chair to the floor, not with noise, but like a cat. She silently took off her shoes, approached Ethan, and whispered something in his ear. The child, who had seemed like a withered plant seconds before, opened his eyes wide, and a mischievous smile lit up his face. Emily pulled from her pocket not the yellow gloves, but 2 socks with little faces painted on the toes. She put them on her hands. "Hello, I'm Mr. Potato," Emily whispered, making a deep, ridiculous voice, moving her right hand in front of Liam's face. Liam let out a muffled giggle, covering his mouth with his hands, as if he knew they were committing a crime. "I'm Mrs. Tomato," she replied with the other hand, tickling Ethan's tummy. The effect was electric. The energy in the room changed instantly. Color returned to the children's cheeks. Ethan sat up, laughing softly, trying to catch Mr. Potato. Liam threw himself onto Emily's back, hugging her. Richard, from his hiding place on high, watched as Emily rolled on the floor with them, but this time in total silence. They played charades, made exaggerated gestures, opened their mouths, simulating war cries that made no sound, jumped on the cushions, landing with feather-like softness. It was a clandestine dance of happiness. He watched as Emily helped Ethan stand. Without a word, she offered him her hands, now disguised as puppets. Ethan stood up, trembling but determined, and took 3 steps towards her, biting his tongue with concentration and joy. "Bravo!" Emily silently gestured, clapping soundlessly. Richard retreated from the balcony, his back pressed against the hallway wall. His heart pounded wildly. He realized he was the villain in this story. He had created a golden cage where happiness had to be smuggled in as if it were illegal. Emily wasn't disobeying out of rebellion. She was disobeying out of love. She was saving his children from the sadness he himself imposed. He looked down at his own hands. They were clean, well-manicured, perfect, and empty. He had never played puppets with socks. He had never rolled on the floor. His wife Laura used to tell him, "Richard, the house can be cleaned." But childhood doesn't come back. He had forgotten. Just as he was about to go downstairs, not knowing if he might join them, perhaps apologize, a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Mrs. Henderson was at the end of the opposite hallway. She hadn't seen Richard spying. She too was spying on the living room downstairs, but her expression was not one of revelation or tenderness. Her eyes were narrowed, fixed on the mute happiness of Emily and the children. In her hands, Mrs. Henderson squeezed a cleaning rag so tightly that her knuckles were white. Richard watched as the old woman turned and silently entered the master bedroom, Richard's room, where the safe was. An alarm sounded in Richard's head. Not a robbery alarm, but something much more sinister. He remembered the accusation about the brooch. He remembered the certainty with which Mrs. Henderson had demanded to search the bag. And now, Seeing her sneak into his room while Emily was distracted downstairs, Richard didn't go down to the living room. Instead, he took off his Italian-soled shoes to make no noise. He became the silent hunter his house needed. He walked towards his own room, stopping just before the door frame, holding his breath. What he saw through the crack left him colder than any previous slight. Mrs. Henderson wasn't cleaning. Mrs. Henderson was in front of his nightstand with the small velvet box where he kept his grandfather's gold watch and the diamond brooch that had supposedly disappeared. The old woman opened the box. The sparkle of the diamonds flashed in the gloom, but she didn't put it in her pocket to steal it. She held it in her hand, looked at it with hatred, and then left the room, but not towards the exit. She headed towards the hallway closet, where Emily hung her coat and left her canvas bag while working. Richard understood everything in a second of brutal clarity. There had been no theft. There was going to be a trap. Mrs. Henderson didn't want the money. She wanted Emily's destruction, and she was about to execute the final phase of her plan. Just when Richard was beginning to see the light, the millionaire felt a new, different anger. It wasn't the hot, reactive anger of the offended father. It was the cold, calculating, and lethal anger of the businessman who discovers he has been betrayed by his right hand. He retreated into the shadows of the hallway, letting Mrs. Henderson pass by with the brooch in her hand, heading towards Emily's backpack. "Do it," Richard whispered to himself, his dark eyes fixed on the old woman's back. "Dig your own grave, Mrs. Henderson. Today the tyranny in this house ends." But before acting, he needed definitive proof. He needed the crime to be consummated so there would be no excuses. No, it was a misunderstanding. No crocodile tears from a 40-year employee. Richard returned to his study, turned on the internal security camera monitor, the ones Mrs. Henderson thought he never looked at, and pressed the record button. The war for the soul of the house had begun, and Richard, for the first time, knew which side he had to fight on. The monitor screen emitted an almost imperceptible electrical hum, but to Mr. Richard, it sounded like an alarm siren. From the darkness of his study, now converted into a makeshift surveillance booth, he observed the grainy black and white image transmitted by the service hallway camera. His hands, resting on the mahogany desk, were clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had turned white. On the monitor, Mrs. Henderson was not the helpful old woman bringing tea. She was a furtive shadow. Richard watched her stop in front of the built-in closet, where Emily kept her canvas bag. The woman looked both ways down the hallway, an instinctive gesture of guilt, checking that there were no eyewitnesses. She didn't know that the digital eye of her employer was dissecting her from upstairs. Mrs. Henderson took the brooch from her pocket. Through the screen, the sparkle of the diamonds was barely a point of white light, but Richard recognized the shape. It was the butterfly brooch he had given his wife Laura on their last anniversary. Seeing that jewel, a symbol of pure and tragic love, in the poisonous hands of his housekeeper, caused him a gag reflex of physical repulsion. With quick, nervous movements, Mrs. Henderson unzipped Emily's bag, reached her hand deeply, searching for a safe hiding place among the nanny's humble clothes. Richard held his breath, feeling a mix of morbid fascination and volcanic fury. He was witnessing a crime in real time. He was watching a lie being fabricated, designed to destroy an innocent life. Mrs. Henderson withdrew her hand, closed the bag, and smoothed the fabric to erase any traces of her manipulation. Then she ran her hand through her gray hair, composed her face into that mask of pious severity she usually wore, and walked towards the living room. Richard slumped back in his chair, exhaling the air he had held. The recording continued to run. He had the proof. He had the smoking gun. But what he felt was not relief. It was corrosive guilt. How many times had this happened before? He remembered the nurse 3 months ago, the one who lost a silver watch. He remembered the young girl who was fired because she had supposedly broken a Ming vase on purpose. Mrs. Henderson had always been the witness, the discoverer, the savior of the family estate. "I've been blind," Richard murmured, running his hands over his face. "I've let a viper guard my nest." Downstairs in the living room, the atmosphere remained one of clandestine peace. Emily, oblivious to the coming storm, continued to play with the twins. Richard could imagine their smiles. He could feel the warmth they radiated, even through the walls and floor that separated them. Emily was mending his children with love and old socks, while upstairs, the machinery of hatred was setting in motion to crush her. Richard stood up. He wasn't going to run down screaming. That would be too easy for Mrs. Henderson. She would deny it, say she was looking for something. She would invent an excuse. No, Richard needed the betrayal to be total. He needed Mrs. Henderson to expose herself, to say the words, to point the finger. He needed to see how far human wickedness would go when it felt unpunished. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his tie, and adopted the coldest, most inscrutable expression from his businessman's repertoire. He was going down to the stage, but this time, he would not be Mrs. Henderson's puppet. He would be the judge, the jury, and, God willing, the moral executioner of the woman who had poisoned his home. Meanwhile, in the living room, Mrs. Henderson entered. She made no sound. At first, she stood in the doorway, watching Emily help Ethan stack 3 wooden blocks. The happiness of the scene was unbearable to the old woman. To see that pauper taking the place of a mother, receiving the smiles of the heirs, was a personal insult to her 40 years of strict service. "Enjoy it while you can, girl, Mrs." Henderson whispered to herself, caressing the empty pocket of her apron, where the brooch had once rested. "Winter has come. Mrs." Henderson took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air for the theatrical scream that would shatter the harmony. It was time to act. Mrs. Henderson's scream was not human. It was the shriek of a wounded seagull, designed to cut through the air and freeze the blood. "Sir, Mr. Richard." The impact in the room was immediate. The tower of blocks Ethan had just built with so much effort collapsed when the child violently startled. Liam, who was laughing on the floor, burst into tears instantly, terrified by the shrill volume. Emily, with the reflexes of someone accustomed to protecting, lunged forward, covering both children with her arms, looking towards the door with wide eyes, expecting to see a fire or an armed intruder, but she only saw Mrs. Henderson. The housekeeper stood in the middle of the living room with her hands on her head, acting out a nervous breakdown worthy of an Academy Award. "It's too much. It's the end," the old woman cried, looking at the ceiling as if asking for divine clemency. "I can't keep quiet any longer. My conscience won't allow it." Richard appeared at the top of the stairs. He descended the steps with exasperating slowness, his face stony. He didn't run. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply descended like a storm cloud, charged with static electricity. "What is the meaning of this scandal, Mrs. Henderson?" Richard asked as he reached the last step. His voice was low, controlled, but it had a dangerous edge that Mrs. Henderson, in her malicious euphoria, failed to detect. "Sir." Mrs. Henderson ran towards him, wringing her hands in a gesture of supplication. "I've tried to be patient. I've tried to give this person a chance, but there are limits. Your wife's blood cries for justice." Emily slowly stood up with Liam clinging to her right leg and Ethan in her arms. Fear closed her throat. She knew she hadn't done anything, but she also knew that in the world of the wealthy, the truth of the poor was worth less than dust. "What are you talking about?" Emily asked, her voice trembling but dignified. "You know what I'm talking about, hypocrite." "Mrs." Henderson spat, turning towards her with eyes injected with hatred. "I've noticed things, sir. Small things, disappearing coins, silverware, but today she's gone too far. I went to clean your nightstand, sir, as I do every Friday, and the blue velvet box was open." Richard didn't blink. He kept his gaze fixed on Mrs. Henderson. "The butterfly brooch." "Mrs." Henderson cried, clutching a hand to her chest. "Mrs. Laura's brooch is gone, and the only person who's been upstairs while you were working, sir, is her. I saw her go up with the excuse of looking for clean towels." It was a crude lie. Emily hadn't been upstairs all day. She was forbidden to set foot on the second floor, save for an explicit order, but the accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic. "I didn't go upstairs, sir," Emily said quickly, looking Richard in the eyes. "I haven't left this room. You were upstairs." "You know I didn't go up." Richard didn't respond to Emily. He remained silent, letting the panic grow, letting Mrs. Henderson become overconfident. "She's lying!" Mrs. Henderson insisted. "They're like rats, sir. They move through the shadows, but this time I've got her. I'm sure she hasn't had time to take it out of the house. She must have it in her belongings, ready to take it as soon as her shift ends. I demand that we search her bag right now, for the memory of Mrs. Laura." The twins cried inconsolably, sensing the aggression in the atmosphere. Ethan hid his face in Emily's neck, drenching her uniform with tears. "Not again," Emily whispered, and a tear of helplessness rolled down her cheek. "You already searched my things once. How many more times do you need to humiliate me?" "As many times as necessary until the truth appears, Mrs." Henderson said, and without waiting for permission, she ran towards the hallway closet where Emily's bag was. Richard followed her at a slow pace. Emily, carrying Ethan and dragging Liam by the hand, followed him too because she had no choice. It was a funeral procession towards her own social execution. Mrs. Henderson pulled out the bag violently, throwing it onto the foyer floor. "Open it, sir!" the old woman demanded. "Open it and see with your own eyes who you've brought into your home." Richard looked at the bag, then at Emily. The young nanny was pale, trembling from head to toe. "Sir, I swear on my mother's life. I don't have anything," Emily pleaded. Her voice broke. "I just want to take care of the children. I don't want your jewels. I don't need them." "That's what old thieves say, Mrs. Henderson declared. Richard bent down. His perfectly manicured hands touched the worn canvas. He slowly opened the zipper. The sound of the zipper ripping through the silence was unbearable. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward with a shark-like smile, awaiting the glimmer of triumph. Richard reached in, moved some clothes aside, and his fingers closed around cold metal and hard stones. He pulled it out slowly. The butterfly brooch glittered under the light of the foyer lamp. The diamonds sparkled with an ironic purity amidst so much moral filth. "Aha!" Mrs. Henderson cried triumphantly, pointing a finger as if it were a sword. "There it is! I knew it! Thief! Miserable! You've stolen from a dead woman!" Emily gasped in horror. She clapped her hands to her mouth, letting go of the children for a second. She recoiled until she hit the wall. "No," Emily murmured, shaking her head, her eyes filled with terror. "That's not mine. I didn't put it there. Someone. Someone? Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Who? Ghosts? Babies? It was you! We caught you red-handed." The old woman turned to Richard, expecting to see an explosion of rage, expecting to see him kick the girl out, expecting the order to call the police. "Sir, call the authorities," Mrs. Henderson urged. "Have her handcuffed. Let her learn that you don't mess with family." Richard stood up, holding the brooch aloft. He looked at it in the light, turning it. Then he lowered his hand and looked at Emily. He saw the absolute terror on her face, the devastation of someone who knows the truth doesn't matter when the evidence is rigged. He saw his children crying at her feet, clinging to her legs like shipwrecked sailors clinging to a mast. And then Richard slowly turned his head towards Mrs. Henderson. The old woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. There was something in Richard's gaze that didn't fit. There was no uncontrolled fury. There was a glacial calm, a deep and terrifying darkness. "You're right, Mrs. Henderson," Richard said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "You don't mess with my family." "Exactly, sir." "That's why you must tell me one thing," Richard interrupted her, taking a step towards the housekeeper, invading her personal space. "How did you know? It was at the bottom of the bag, under the socks." Mrs. Henderson blinked nervously. I assumed. Thieves always hide things at the bottom. It's instinct, sir." "Instinct?" Richard repeated, savoring the word with disgust. "Curious instinct, because from where you were standing, it was impossible to see the bottom of the bag before I reached my hand in. The air in the room changed. Mrs. Henderson's trap had snapped shut, but she still didn't realize her own foot was caught in the snare." "Sir, what are you implying?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice losing strength. "The evidence is right there. She stole it." "The evidence is there, yes," Richard said, squeezing the brooch in his fist. "But the truth is a much more complicated thing, don't you think?" Emily watched the scene, confused, her heart pounding. Why wasn't he yelling at her? Why was he looking at Mrs. Henderson with that predatory intensity? "Emily," Richard said, without taking his eyes off the old woman, "take the children to their room, close the door, and cover their ears." "Sir, Emily tried to speak. "Do it," Richard ordered, and this time he shouted, but not with anger towards her, but with an urgency of protection. Emily, trembling, carried Ethan and took Liam's hand, running upstairs, fleeing the nightmare. When the sound of the children's footsteps disappeared and the click of the bedroom door closing was heard, Richard was left alone with Mrs. Henderson in the foyer. The silence was absolute. Mrs. Henderson took a step back, feeling real fear for the first time. "Sir, you're scaring me. We should call the police and get this over with." "Oh, don't worry, Mrs. Henderson," Richard said, taking his mobile phone from his pocket with his free hand. "We're going to get this over with, but I won't call the police just yet. First, I want to show you a movie, a very interesting movie I just filmed." Richard unlocked the phone. His fingers moved across the screen, searching for the file connected to the security cloud. "A movie?" Mrs. Henderson asked in a thin voice. Richard turned the phone screen towards her. "Look," he whispered. On the small, bright screen, the service hallway was visible in black and white. An older woman in a gray uniform was seen looking from side to side. She was seen taking a shiny brooch from her pocket. She was seen opening the bag. Mrs. Henderson's face collapsed. The mask of the loyal servant melted, revealing the naked terror of a discovered criminal. her knees knocked together. "Sir, I can explain," she stammered, backing towards the door. "There's nothing to explain," Richard said, advancing towards her relentlessly. "What needs to be decided now is whether you will leave this house walking or in a patrol car." The climax had arrived, but not as Mrs. Henderson had written it. Divine Justice had just entered the foyer, wearing a suit and tie. The phone continued to loop the video again and again, showing the betrayal in black and white. Mrs. Henderson stared at the screen, as if it were a mirror, reflecting her own rotten soul. And for the first time in decades, she had no quick retort, no sharp lie, no pious excuse. 40 years, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling, not with regret, but with impotent rage. "I have given 40 years of my life to this family. I've cleaned up their messes. I've kept their secrets. And you're going to throw me out for a piece of metal? For a trinket?" Richard slowly put the phone back in his pocket. The calm he felt was terrifying, even to himself. It was the calm of someone who has survived a shipwreck and sees the shore. "I'm not throwing you out for the metal, Mrs. Henderson," Richard said, stepping towards the front door and opening it wide. The night air entered the foyer, cold and clean. "I'm throwing you out because you tried to destroy an innocent person to feed your ego. I'm throwing you out because you turned my mourning into a dictatorship. I'm throwing you out because in trying to protect my house, you turned it into a prison." Mrs. Henderson straightened up. If she was going to fall, she wouldn't do it on her knees. Her face hardened, regaining that mask of aristocratic disdain she had copied from her former employers. "I do what I do for the good of the lineage," she spat, smoothing her apron with furious hands. "That girl, that nobody, she's going to ruin those children. She's going to make them weak, soft, like her. You think you've won, Mr. Richard, but you're left alone with the chaos. When those children grow up and don't know how to behave in society, you'll remember me. I'd rather them be happy than decent like you," Richard replied, pointing towards the darkness of the street. "Out. You have 10 minutes to get your things off my property. If in 11 minutes you're still here, I'll call the police and show them the video. And believe me, judges don't like jewel thieves, no matter how old they are." Mrs. Henderson let out a snort of contempt. She walked towards the door, her hard-soled shoes echoing one last time on the marble she had polished so much. As she reached the threshold, she stopped and turned. Her eyes were two wells of bitterness. Mrs. Laura would never have allowed this. She launched her last poison dart. Richard felt the blow, but this time he didn't bleed. "Mrs. Laura," Richard said with a firm voice, "would have fired anyone who made her children cry. Goodbye, Mrs. Henderson." The old woman stepped out into the night without looking back. Richard closed the door. The dry click of the bolt echoed throughout the house, a definitive sound. The silence that followed was not the oppressive silence from before. It was a silence of emptiness, of cleared space. The shadow was gone, but the crisis wasn't over. Upstairs, the damage was already done. Richard climbed the stairs. His legs felt like lead. Each step was an accusation. He had allowed that to happen. He had been an accomplice by omission. He reached the second-floor hallway. The children's bedroom door was closed. From inside, there were no hysterical cries, but something much more heartbreaking, a soft, trembling murmur. Richard pressed his ear against the wood. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word," Emily sang. Her voice was broken by suppressed sobs. She was off-key from fear, but she kept singing. Even at the moment she believed she was going to be arrested, going to lose her reputation and her freedom, her priority was still to calm Liam and Ethan. Richard leaned his forehead against the door. He felt a sharp pang of pain in his chest, so acute that he had to close his eyes. That was the circus he had despised. That fierce loyalty was what he had called a lack of professionalism. He felt like the poorest man in the world. He gently turned the doorknob. It was locked. Emily had bolted it, barricading herself against the monster she believed was coming for her. "Emily," he called. His voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. "Emily, please, open the door." The singing stopped abruptly. A stifled sob was heard, and the sound of someone moving to protect something. "Don't come in," she pleaded from the other side in a panicked voice. "Please, sir, don't let the police in here. Not in front of them. I'll come out. I surrender. But don't scare the children." The request tore his soul apart. She was negotiating her own capture to protect the children's innocence. "There's no police, Emily," Richard said, placing his hand flat against the wood. "Mrs. Henderson is gone. It's over. Open the door. I need you to see something." There was a long, tense silence. Richard could hear her agitated breathing on the other side. Finally, the latch clicked. The door opened a few centimeters. Emily peered out. Her eyes were swollen and red, her makeup smudged, her hair disheveled. She held Ethan in one arm like a shield, and Liam clung to her leg, hidden behind her skirt. She looked at him with terror, expecting the trap, expecting handcuffs. Richard didn't push the door open. He stayed in the hallway, respecting her space, his hands open and empty to show he brought nothing but his own shame. "She's gone," he repeated. "I fired her." Emily blinked, confused, hugging the baby tighter. "You fired her?" "But the brooch, she said she put it there." Richard took out his phone again. "I have it recorded. I saw everything." Emily looked at the phone, then at Richard. Her shoulders, which had been tense as violin strings, slumped. The relief was so physical that she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. Ethan, sensing the danger had passed, rested his head on her shoulder and sighed. "So, I'm not going to jail?" she asked, with an innocence that Richard found unbearable. "No," Richard said, shaking his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. "The only person who should be judged in this house is me, for having doubted you." Emily opened the door completely, allowing Richard to enter the sanctuary of the children's room. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a star-shaped nightlight. There were toys on the floor, but it didn't feel messy. It felt lived in. Richard entered, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Emily walked to the crib and gently placed Ethan down with infinite softness. The child, exhausted by the day's drama, immediately curled up. Liam, who was still awake, looked at his father with distrust from behind the nanny's legs. "Forgive me, sir," Emily said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "It's just that I was very scared. My mother depends on me. If I go to jail, she'll die." Richard sat on a low chair, one of those small chairs for reading stories that he never used. He was at Liam's height. "Emily," Richard said, looking at his intertwined hands, "don't apologize to me. Never apologize to me again." Richard looked up. His eyes, usually cold and analytical, were moist. "I saw the robbery video." "Yes, but then I kept watching more." Emily tensed slightly. "More? I reviewed the recordings from last week, from the days I was away, and you thought you were alone," Richard confessed. Emily lowered her head, ashamed. "Sir, I know we danced in the kitchen and I let Liam eat ice cream on the rug. I cleaned it, I swear." "I wasn't looking at the stains, Emily." Richard interrupted her softly. "I was looking at my children." Richard took out his tablet, which he had brought with him from the study, and turned it on. The bluish light illuminated his tired face. He searched for a file and pressed play. He turned the screen so Emily could see it. It was a recording from 2 days ago. In the image, Emily sat on the living room floor with a giant book open. Liam and Ethan sat beside her, mesmerized. Emily didn't just read. She acted. She made voices. She became the monster and the princess. But what Richard pointed to wasn't Emily, but the children. "Look at Liam," Richard said, pointing to the screen. "Look how he looks at you." In the video, Liam looked at Emily with absolute adoration, copying her gestures, laughing before she finished the joke. And Ethan, the child who supposedly couldn't move, was trying to climb up Emily's back to see the book better, using a strength and coordination that doctors said he didn't have. "I didn't know Liam knew how to clap," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "I saw it in the video. He learned to clap last Tuesday with you. I missed it." He moved to the next video. It was the meal scene. Emily was doing the airplane with the spoon. The children ate vegetables without protesting, laughing. "I didn't know Ethan liked broccoli," Richard continued, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. "With me, he spits it out. With you, he eats it laughing." Richard turned off the tablet and placed it on the floor. He covered his face with his hands. The ice wall finally broke. The millionaire, the man of iron, began to cry a silent, deep sob that shook his shoulders. "I thought I gave them everything," Richard sobbed. "The best house, the best clothes, the best doctors. And you came with rubber gloves and old socks and gave them the only thing I couldn't give them, life." Emily stood frozen. She had never seen a man like him, so powerful, collapse like that. The instinct that made her care for the children activated towards the father. She approached slowly, hesitating. "Sir, you love them," she said softly. "That's what's important. Love is learned. Just as Ethan learned to walk, he just needs to lose the fear of getting down on the floor." Richard lifted his red, wet face. He looked at Liam, who had approached curiously upon seeing his father cry. The child, with that pure empathy of childhood, stretched out his small hand and touched Richard's knee. "Daddy boo-boo," Liam said. It was a shot to the heart. "Yes, Liam, Daddy has a big boo-boo right here," Richard said, touching his chest. Without thinking, Richard did something he hadn't done since his wife's funeral. He slid from the chair and sat on the floor, on the rug, at the same level as his son and the nanny. He didn't care that his $3,000 suit pants wrinkled. He didn't care about dignity. He extended his arms towards Liam. The child hesitated for a second, looking at Emily. She nodded with a warm smile, giving him permission. Liam walked towards his father and let himself be hugged. Richard buried his face in his son's hair, smelling of baby shampoo and innocence. "Xen, Emily," Richard said from the floor, without letting go of the child. "I don't want you to work for me." Emily felt a sudden chill. After all this, he was firing her. "Sir, I don't want you to be my employee," Richard corrected. Looking up, his eyes no longer had barriers. "I want you to be part of this family. I want you to teach me, not to clean or organize. I want you to teach me to be the father they see in you." Richard extended a hand to her. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a gesture of deep respect, of equals, a blood pact. "Stay, please, not for the salary. I'll double your salary. I'll give you whatever you want. Stay to teach me how to play." Emily looked at Richard's hand. She looked at Liam hugging him. She looked at Ethan sleeping in the crib. She understood that the battle was over. The coldness of the mansion was dissipating. Emily smiled, and this time it was a calm smile, without fear. "I'll stay, sir," she said, taking Richard's hand, "but with one condition." "Whatever it is," he said quickly. "Tomorrow, you put on the puppet socks. I'll be the audience." Richard let out a laugh, a real laugh, rusty, but genuine, that sounded strange in that room accustomed to silence. "Deal," he said. And at that moment, under the dim light of the star lamp, with the rich father on the floor and the poor nanny standing, the true fortune of that house was sealed. It wasn't in the safe, it was on the rug. The next morning did not dawn like any other in the mansion. Usually, the sun entered through the armored windows, illuminating dust particles in a mausoleum-like silence. But today, the sun seemed to enter with permission to touch everything. Richard went down to the kitchen at 8 o'clock, as his biological clock dictated. However, for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't wearing his Italian-cut navy suit, nor a silk tie tight around his neck like an elegant noose. He wore gray sweatpants and a white cotton t-shirt, clothes he had rescued from the bottom of a forgotten drawer, vestiges of a time when he, too, knew what a lazy Sunday was. Upon entering the kitchen, the smell was not that of the black, bitter coffee Mrs. Henderson used to serve him in solitude. It smelled of vanilla, warm milk, and toast. Emily was there with her back to him, humming a soft melody while stirring a pan. Liam was in his high chair, his face smeared with fruit puree, banging the tray with a plastic spoon. Seeing his father, the child stopped. There was a second of hesitation, a conditioned reflex from months of coldness. But Richard, instead of ignoring him or asking for silence, did something that changed the room's atmosphere. He winked at him. "Good morning, champ," Richard said, approaching the high chair. Liam let out a nervous giggle and hit the table again, this time with enthusiasm. Emily turned, surprised by her employer's informality. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes still had a slight trace of swelling from the previous night's crying, but her gaze was clear and calm. "I didn't know you'd be down so early. Coffee is almost ready." "I don't want coffee, Emily," he replied, sitting in one of the kitchen chairs, not at the head of the formal dining room table. "Today, I want whatever they're having." Emily smiled, a smile that lit up the kitchen. "More than the halogen lights." "Banana oatmeal with crackers?" she asked, amused. "If that's what gives you the energy to keep up with these two, then yes, oatmeal," Richard said, taking the spoon Liam offered him. That breakfast marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. There were no business meetings, no calls to New York. Richard spent the morning learning, and it was the hardest lesson of his life. He discovered that running a multinational corporation was child's play compared to changing a diaper on a moving target or convincing Ethan not to put a Lego piece up his nose. Mid-morning, the front doorbell rang. The dry sound reverberated through the house. Richard tensed. Emily, who was on the floor helping Ethan stretch his legs, looked up with fear. "It must be her," Emily whispered. Mrs. Henderson had threatened to come back for the rest of her things. Richard stood up. His posture changed. The playful father disappeared for a second, and the man of steel returned. But this time, the steel was a shield for his family. "Stay here," he ordered softly. "I'll handle it." Richard walked towards the entrance. Opening the door, he found not Mrs. Henderson, but a courier with a box and, Behind him, on the sidewalk, a patrol car that had come to take a statement regarding the attempted theft complaint that Mrs. Henderson, in her delirium of revenge, had tried to file against Emily that same morning, claiming wrongful dismissal. The old woman's audacity knew no bounds. Even outside the house, she tried to continue manipulating reality. Richard stepped onto the porch. The police officer approached, notepad in hand. "Good morning, sir. We have a complaint from a Mrs. Gertrudis H. She claims your employee verbally assaulted and robbed her." Richard raised his hand, stopping the officer with a gesture of absolute authority. "Officer," Richard said calmly, "Mrs. Henderson was dismissed yesterday for continuous theft and defamation. I have high-definition security recordings showing how she herself removed jewelry from my safe to incriminate the nanny. If she wishes to proceed with that false complaint, I would be happy to hand you the USB drive with the evidence right now so you can proceed with her immediate arrest for false accusation and domestic theft." The officer paused, lowered his notepad, and changed his tone. "Understood, sir. If there's video evidence, the situation changes drastically. I'll speak to the lady to dissuade her." "Do more than that," Richard said, taking a step closer, his gaze icy. "Tell her that if she ever utters my family's name again, or comes within 500 meters of this house, she'll be the one in jail, and there will be no bail to get her out." The patrol car left. Mrs. Henderson's shadow finally dissipated, not by magic, but by the firmness of a father who no longer delegated the protection of his home. Returning to the living room, Richard brought with him something more important than a legal victory. He brought an envelope he had been preparing in his study overnight. He found Emily sitting on the sofa with Ethan asleep on her lap. The image was of such profound peace that Richard felt afraid to break it. He sat opposite her at the coffee table, ignoring etiquette. "Emily," he said softly. She opened her eyes. "Alert. All clear, sir. All perfect. Mrs. Henderson will never bother us again." The relief on Emily's face was palpable. She sighed deeply, stroking the sleeping child's back. "But we need to talk business," Richard continued, placing the envelope on the table. Emily looked at the white envelope. Fear returned to her eyes. Was it a confidentiality agreement? New, strict rules? "Sir, I promise I will comply with everything we discussed last night." "The socks, the games, open it," he interrupted her. Emily took the envelope carefully, trying not to wake Ethan. She pulled out the paper. It wasn't a severance check. It was a new employment contract. Her eyes scanned the lines and widened dramatically when she reached the salary figure in the final clause. "Sir, this is too much. It's triple what I was earning." And here it says, Emily read aloud, her voice trembling. "Full medical coverage for the employee and immediate family members of the first degree." Richard nodded, looking at his intertwined hands. "You told me your mother was ill, that she depended on you. I did some research last night. I know the treatments for her condition are expensive, and public health care has waiting lists of months." "Yes, sir. She's been waiting 6 months for a hip operation." "Not anymore," Richard said, looking up and meeting her eyes with a human intensity. "I spoke with Dr. Thompson, the head of orthopedics at Central Hospital. They're expecting her on Monday, all expenses paid." Emily clasped a hand to her mouth. Tears burst forth suddenly, without warning. She wasn't crying for the money. She was crying because someone had seen her invisible pain. She was crying because the man who seemed like a robot 24 hours ago had just saved her mother's life. "Why?" she asked in a thin voice. "Why are you doing this for me? I'm just the nanny." "No," Richard corrected firmly. "You are the woman who taught my son to walk when I didn't believe in him. You are the one who brought laughter back to this house when I only brought silence. Saving your mother is the least I can do to thank you for saving my children. And me." Emily couldn't hold back. With Ethan still in her arms, she leaned forward and took Richard's hand. She didn't kiss it. She simply squeezed it tightly, conveying a gratitude that words couldn't contain. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Richard." "Call me Richard," he said, squeezing her hand back. "Just Richard." Epilogue. 6 months later, snow fell softly over the garden, covering the perfectly manicured lawn with a white blanket. But inside the house, the climate was tropical. The living room, which once looked like a luxury hotel lobby, had undergone a radical transformation. The beige leather sofa was still there, but now it was covered with brightly colored blankets and mismatched cushions. In the corner, where there was once a cold metal abstract sculpture, there was now a mountain of cushions serving as a fort. And in the center of the rug, the Millionaire was unrecognizable. Richard lay face up, dressed in jeans, worn at the knees. In his right hand, he wore a blue sock with hand-stitched button eyes. In his left, a red one with yellow yarn simulating hair. "Attention, Citizens of Carpet Kingdom, Richard boomed in a fake, deep voice, making the blue sock speak. The tickle monster approaches. Two small whirlwinds shot out from behind the sofa. Liam and Ethan, now a year and a half old, and running with enviable stability, launched their attack. "Ah, Daddy!" they shouted, laughing heartily, throwing themselves onto him mercilessly. Ethan, the child who wasn't supposed to walk, ran the fastest of the two. His legs were strong, his movements confident. He dove flat onto his father's stomach, laughing hysterically as Richard attacked him with Mr. Sock. Emily watched the scene from the kitchen doorway with a hot cup of tea in her hands. She no longer wore the blue caregiver uniform and rubber gloves. She wore comfortable clothes, jeans, and a wool sweater. She still worked there, but her role had mutated. She was no longer the invisible employee. She was the aunt, the confidant, the co-parent. Richard, trapped under the weight of his children's love, turned his head and saw Emily watching them. "Help!" he cried dramatically, extending his hand towards her. "Emily, save me! They're devouring me!" Emily laughed, placed her cup on a small table, and slowly walked closer. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said with a mischievous smile. In the living room jungle, only the strongest survive. And instead of helping him, Emily also lay down on the floor, joining the tickle battle. The four rolled on the expensive rug, an indistinguishable mass of arms, legs, and laughter. At that moment, if someone had taken a photo, they wouldn't have been able to distinguish who owned the mansion and who was the employee. They would only have seen a family, a strange family, mended with broken pieces that had been joined with the strongest glue in the world. Time shared on the floor. The camera slowly zooms out through the window, showing the house illuminated in the middle of the winter night. It was no longer the quietest and most elegant house in the neighborhood. It was the loudest and, undoubtedly, the richest. Richard had learned the final lesson. A man is not a millionaire by what he has in the bank, but by how many times his children run towards him when he walks through the door. And as he hugged Ethan and Liam, feeling their hearts beat against his, Richard knew that he had finally truly come home. And